I'm Liam Billingham.
I'm George Fagopoulos.
And this is
Oeuvre Busters.
Oeuvre Busters. It's getting a little less exciting because everyone knows the name of the show. We've done like 70 of these for us to pretend to not know the name of the show.
Have we done 70 of them?
Something like that. We're close to it. We're really, really close.
We need
to
to
it.
record a native French speaker saying it.
Ooh,
that would be something.
That would be really much better than our broken pronunciation.
Let me. I'll text Godard right now and ask him what he's doing.
I think you guys should have a porn parody called Oeuvre Bustiers.
Nice.
Ooh, that's really, really good. A great drop-in for our guest today to appear with
Sorry,
this
I
amazing...
can't not talk.
I wanted to roll with that, though.
100%.
I wanted to go through different variations of porn parody names for our podcast.
There's a little bit of existential dread on my part when we do our banter for a few seconds for Inside Baseball, and I'm like, we got to get to the guest. So the fact that you just dropped in, I think, is perfect. Welcome to the show.
Hi.
Inkoo. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Oh, absolutely. I'll read your bio real quick if that's okay. So Inkoo Kang is TV critic at The Hollywood Reporter and host of the About Almovodar Podcast. She was previously a staff writer at Slate and TV critic at MTV News. Rest in peace. MTV News. That's the formal name, right? It was the whole thing. How are you doing? How are you holding up in our endless isolation life that we're living?
I am really actually okay. I think this whole quarantine situation has been a real drag of me, in that my pandemic lifestyle is actually not that different from my regular lifestyle. So
has it given you time to write?
What?
Has it given you time to write?
For my job?
Well, I mean, just more so than I think you normally would. Do you feel like it has? I mean, a lot of people have been oddly productive in ways that they weren't before. Do you feel like in some sort of way it has kind of given you more opportunities to write?
No, but I have now a lot more time to watch reality TV. So I think that's something.
That is for sure.
Something.
I mean, yeah, this idea of productivity in quarantine is people are like, oh, you must be getting so much done. I'm like, I look at my phone. I'm on Twitter so much that it's affecting my personality, I think, a little bit.
It's definitely rewired my brain for sure. Yeah. For example, as I texted you, or as we were talking about earlier in regards to a film like this, which obviously we'll talk about, in which I look at the running time, and if it's anything above 100 minutes, I'm like, ooh, this is going to be a challenge.
For sure. Again, thank you to Inkoo for watching a 400-minute movie for our podcast.
I definitely agree to this without looking at the runtime, and then as soon as I put it on last night, deeply regretted it. Honestly, thought about canceling on you guys just because I was like, do I have the bandwidth for a black and white 4 and 2.5 hour movie? And then I thought I would be a good guy and stick with this. We can get into whether that was worth it or not.
Well, speaking of good guys, George, what movie are we talking about?
So Liam,
what very long, impenetrable black and white foreign film are we talking about today?
We are not doing this movie any justice so far. But we are talking about 1960s, The Bad Sleep Well, which is a loose adaptation of a little-known play called Hamlet, by, I believe, a playwright named Bill Shakespeare. I think that's his name. Yeah, Billy Shakespeare. I think he's up and coming. So The Bad Sleep Well tells the story of Koichi Nishi, a Hamlet-esque character who infiltrates the family and company of Iwabuchi, a corrupt company executive who killed Nishi's father 5 years before the film begins. The film begins with Nishi marrying Iwabuchi's daughter, Yoshiko, who has a disability. During the wedding, a lavish wedding cake is revealed that hints at the death of Nishi's father, which is kind of a sly reference to Hamlet's play within a play. From there on, Nishi recruits Wada, who's a lower-level executive from the company, in order to help him reveal the corruption at the heart of the company. The film slowly moves through Nishi's attempts to get his father-in-law arrested for corruption. At some point, Nishi also kidnaps Murayama, who's played by Liam
Takashi Shimura,
the legend himself, another exec who holds company secrets, and who actually figures out that Nishi's true identity as the son of the man who was killed 5 years ago. The film ends with Iwabuchi killing Nishi and Wada and Moriyama off screen, and he makes it look like a drunk driving accident. I'm sure we'll also talk about the ending of the film, which to me was kind of the weakest part. And the film ends with Iwabuchi's children, including Yoshiko, disowning him because they find out, obviously, that he's responsible for the death of Nishi. And at the very end, Iwabuchi takes a phone call from the company executives who basically kind of tell him to take a vacation. And he apologizes for not knowing what time of the day it is because he couldn't sleep well the previous night. A not-so-subtle callback to the title. The end.
The movie is directed by Akira Kurosawa. It's produced by Akira Kurosawa and Tomoyuki Tanaka. The screenwriters, there's multiples, and there's an interesting story about the writing of this movie. But it was written by Hideo Ogune, Ijiro Hisaita, Akira Kurosawa, Ryozu Kukushima, and Shinobu Hashimoto. The incredible score is by Masaru Sato. The cinematography is Yuzuru Azawa. The film was edited, like all of these films, by Akira Kurosawa. The production company, interestingly, was Toho Studios, and this was the first film where Toho said, we're not putting up all the money for this movie. So Kurosawa had to form a production company that then co-produced a lot of his films with Toho, and the film was distributed by Toho. The cast will sort of hit the regulars for the Kurosawa people, cast that we've been talking about. Toshiro Mifune plays Kochi Nishi. Masayuki Mori, who's actually the lead of The Idiot, which is the film we were just chatting about, is Vice President Iwabuchi. Kyoko Kagawa, who this is her second film with Kurosawa, but will go on to play a big part in his upcoming films, and is the actress most readily identified with him, apparently, is Yoshiko Nishi. And Tatsuya Mihashi plays Tatsuo Iwabuchi, and the great Takashi Shimura plays Moriyama. And the other big name that I think we've come back to a couple times is Kamatari Fujiwara, who's Wada, who also plays... he's one of the main characters in The Hidden Fortress. He's the actor in Lower Depths. He is in Seven Samurai, and he's sort of the most like chameleon-esque. He's unrecognizable from movie to movie. And then in a brief role is Kurosawa's original sort of leading man. Susumu Fujita plays a detective for about 20 seconds at the beginning of this movie. And Koji Mitsui, who's so good in The Lower Depths, which is one of the last films we talked about, plays the reporter. One just quick interesting fact about the production of this movie is that the original draft was written by Kurosawa's nephew, who gave him the idea, and then they took the script and adapted it to the point where he's not credited with the writing of the movie. But there's a funny story about how he bumped into his uncle in Paris on a business trip, and Kurosawa was so drunk that he started screaming like, "This is the guy that wrote The Bad Sleep Well!" Like this, and he was like, "Stop it! I don't want like you made the movie," and like
That's
sort
amazing.
of an embarrassing.
Wait, did he give him the Hamlet
story.
idea?
He wrote the original draft based on like corruption stuff that was going on in Japan, and they took that and brought the Hamlet aspect into it. So there you have it. Just a few interesting things. The movie was initially pretty disliked by American critics, and only in the past, like I'd say 20 years has it gotten more credit, and a lot of people consider it underrated. Inkoo, what did you think of The Bad Sleep Well?
I really wish that... Sorry, I had muted myself because my dog was making a bunch of noise.
No worries.
I really wish that I had some sort of like essay to read before getting into the movie. I generally like to go into a movie cold, but I think the movie starts with this 20-minute wedding scene basically. And it just takes forever. There's like really interesting stuff in the wedding scene, and I assume we'll talk about that. But basically, I really wanted to know what was like whatever news scandal was obviously happening in Japan that Kurosawa was responding to. And then I think that the other like thing that I kept thinking was, this movie is so crazy, and yet for all of its craziness, it's really paced so poorly, at least from like a modern perspective, that it's really hard to appreciate how nuts balls it is. There's like a point at which like a guy is thinking about like throwing himself into a volcano, and that is maybe like the seventh like craziest thing to happen in this movie. And yet it was like
crazy
really
things in Bad Sleep Well ranked. It.
And yet it was like really hard to get like a sense of like all of the craziness. Just because everything was like really spread out, and I think either Liam or George said that it felt really impenetrable, and I really felt that as well.
That scene with the volcano is crazy too, because it's like, oh yeah, I'm just going to drive to the outskirts of town and throw myself into the volcano. You know, the volcano that's like 20 miles down the road. That's where I'm going to commit suicide. I was like, what the hell's going on? It also reminded me of the ending of Pasolini's Theorem or Teorama, I believe it's in the
that's another
Italian?
impenetrable movie I stupidly watched on quarantine.
But you know what I'm talking about too, where it's like the guy at the end is like walking through this like desolate landscape. It's a beautiful scene, but yeah, I was also like, what the fuck is going on? Where are they? Is that a volcano? And then later on, like 10 minutes later, you find out, yeah, it's in fact a volcano. And I was like, this is really odd.
I think like the main thing is that it's a revenge plot, but it's really hard to get a sense of like what the revenge is or how it's supposed to play out, because the tactics that the main character uses, who is basically like a prosecutor / undercover guy who like marries into like the CEO's family, and then I don't know, is like very pure-hearted, and so he like falls in love with his wife but like won't have sex with her or something. I just felt like I don't understand how faking an employee's death and then like using that employee as to like forcing him to like pretend to be a ghost, and then like forcing like another guy he wants to blackmail into like looking at a picture of his dead father's corpse. Like, so many crazy things happen in this movie, but I was like, how is this supposed to get you the revenge that you want? I don't even know what you're working toward. And so it felt extremely slack. And then the runtime didn't help.
Yeah, the runtime does not help.
It's funny to talk about the movie and sort of think of it as crazy. So this is the second time I'd seen it, and I made the mistake I made the first time, which at like 8:15 on a Monday, I was like, oh, time to watch The Bad Sleep Well. And I was like, it's 2.5 hours long. Like, I'd kind of forgotten how long it was. I thought it was one of the shorter movies.
The first time you watched it, you said, did you watch it during quarantine? No.
I watched it Monday. No, I watched it like a decade ago.
Oh, okay,
and I liked it. I really, really like Kurosawa's noir films, and I particularly like, I mean, the one that, you know, I love the most of all of his films is High and Low, which this movie definitely feels like something of a rehearsal for on some level in terms of different decisions that are being made. Particularly like sort of this opening sequence that lasts for a long, long stretch of time. That is in High and Low, it's almost the first hour of the film is a single scene. It's almost like a one-act play. But this is a really strange movie, and I don't think it occurred to me how strange it was until we talked about, like, yeah, there's a guy that pretends to be a ghost. Like, that's nuts. I kind of forgot that that's what's going on there. I think the movie looks amazing. I'm obsessed with the images, but I don't know that it plays as well at home as it would in a movie theater. This is definitely one of those ones where I was like, man, I'd really like to be in the dark with a bunch of other people having the experience of watching this film. I think it would make it much easier to watch. And this is something we can get into, but I do think the movie does some somewhat interesting things with Nishi's character in like the final hour, but this is a hard one. Like, this is sort of advanced level Kurosawa to me. I feel like it's a hard one too. It's not like you're going to be like, you should watch Rashomon and Stray Dog and then watch The Bad Sleep Well. It's like that. This is like upper sort of, 700 level class for Kurosawa. George, what do you think?
So I had like the same kind of experience watching this, or the same kind of thinking after we saw The Lower Depths, and I was like, I'm glad I saw this. There's a lot in it that I loved. Like the wedding scene I thought was incredible. I thought that there were tons of like amazing visuals, like the volcano. That scene where he nearly throws the guy out the window is incredible. But yeah, I think slack, which is how
slack is good.
Yeah, Inkoo described it, is like definitely a good way to describe this film. Like, it could have definitely been 20 minutes shorter, and I think it would have retained still like its power. Would have been probably like a bit more powerful, even though I also at times like catch myself saying things like that, and like get it, like obviously we're supposed to be critical, but I hate saying things like that because obviously like Kurosawa was a master and he should kind of do what he wants to do, and good for him. But I do feel if it was a bit shorter, it would have been better. But it's funny because the first 45 minutes or the first hour or so is really taken by it. And especially also in the beginning where it kind of almost becomes like this procedural where you're slowly getting more and more information about the corruption, about what's at stake. And I was like, oh my God, it almost feels like a documentary at times, you know, with like all the shots of like the newspapers and like the snippets of like dialogue. So those parts for me worked really well. And it was about an hour and a half in that I was like, oh, like this, the more melodramatic elements of it, like the guy pretending to be a ghost, I was like, I'm not having this. It's not working for me.
I think that the other thing that really felt deflating is that it's sort of this like awkward marriage, at least to me, between a film noir. There's like corporate corruption and people basically doing terrible things, and melodrama, right? But I feel like with I think part of like the melodrama is that there are these like characters who are really good and these characters who are really bad. And film noir sort of likes to have the dynamic where like all of the characters are really bad. And I think I liked the movie a lot more when I thought it was going in the direction of these cops are doing some crazy ass schemes that like rival in its badness like what is happening on the corporate side. And so when I was like, well, so like basically the first hour or so of the movie, all of the stuff that the cops were doing were so fucking over the top that I was like, oh, is this like a movie about like how all the institutions are bad? And then when you sort of get toward the end and it turns out like basically the, I don't know, like arrogant Ivanka of like this family is actually like completely pure-hearted and we're supposed to be on their side, and they're going to like reject their dad's money and love, and they don't care about like having a privileged life. Like they're just going to like say fuck you, dad. I was like, am I supposed to believe this? Like this is not play for me in 2020.
It didn't work for me in terms of the brother. It worked for me with Yoshiko, but the brother especially, who was kind of like a dick in the very beginning, right? He's kind of this arrogant, like really aggressive kind of bro. When his sudden turn at the end against the father, like that I definitely did not buy. I bought it more with the daughter.
I like the brother. So like he comes in like really aggro with this wedding speech about like how he really wants to make sure that So one thing that I think primes you to like the brother is that you can tell this is a wedding for a bunch of rich people because all of the people giving the toasts are basically like people from the company who like do not care about like who's getting married. They're only there to basically pay their respects to like the dad, the CEO of the company. And so when the brother comes in, he's like the very first person who like seems to give an actual shit about like the bride. And so I was like, oh, that's sweet. Like a brother can love a sister. Like, okay, I didn't expect that. And so much of like that really great wedding scene is about how capitalism is like completely infecting the family. So much so that like this wedding basically becomes like corporate pageantry, right? And so, yeah, team brother.
Yeah. Liam, where do you stand as far as the brother goes?
I think
the layerties.
I think the point that, no, it's fine, that's being made is that there's almost like a friction between some of the stylistic choices in the movie and some of the like film noir-y things. Like the other way to think about the pace being what was the word we used? Slack. Is I wonder if it's deliberate. Like I wonder if there's a little bit of too much pull from the tragedy of Hamlet being incorporated into the into the film noir aspect, because every image in this movie is beautiful, but they're so absolute, and they're so at times like they're almost like they're still lifes or pictures that we see, and there doesn't seem to be as much tension going on between the characters. Like, the film was made in cinema or Toho scope, which was essentially CinemaScope, and like it's cool to see a Kurosawa movie that's largely interiors shot in this, like, you know, these environments and shot in a wide frame, but the images are so good that I feel like sometimes there's not a lot of life behind them, and I wonder if that gets in the way, that the sort of desire to say something about the way capitalism infects the family makes it difficult for us to empathize with anyone, because there's a remove that we're meant to feel. Like, if the commentary about the corporate culture, capitalism, post-war Americanization, Japan, as it's often described, like, it's almost like Kurosawa's sympathies are like hard to parse and where they sit. I feel like, and I'm curious what you guys thought of Mifune's performance, because I think it suffers from this like austerity that gets in the way of us really sympathizing and understanding. I think this is one of the few performances which I think is good, but it's also really inscrutable. I feel it, but I don't think I sympathize with him.
There's no
as
layers
much as I
there.
thought I would. Mm-hmm.
There's no layers, or there are layers?
I mean, he has basically two motivations, right? He has the motivation of the like basically revenge for his dad, and then his other motivation that complicates that motivation. That first motivation is that he actually really likes this woman that he married as part of his ploy to take down the CEO.
Right.
But I think, like, when I was complaining before about, like, how I didn't understand, like, why he was doing the things that he was doing, like, one of the things about film noir, like, is that they're very intricately plotted, and sometimes they're, like, too, like, intricately plotted, but you can always tell, like, why people are taking certain actions. And as I said before, this is one where I just, like, didn't understand why anyone was doing the things that they were doing. And so I found that really frustrating, not knowing like what he was thinking. And so that made it really hard to identify with him, because all of his actions seem so opaque to me.
Did you feel that the revenge then for like the father's death just wasn't, I guess, obvious enough, or that there was just kind of, because one interesting thing that I thought about was like, oh, we don't know anything about the relationship with his father really, other than like these vague snippets of dialogue of like, oh yeah, he loved him. Oh yeah, here's a picture of him at his funeral. But we don't really get any sense of what that relationship was like. So was that also part of like what didn't work for you, that you couldn't kind of get a sense of like, oh, he like really had a relationship with his dad and that's why he wants to get revenge on these folks?
I mean, part of it is also just like the fact that he's an illegitimate son, right? And so
yeah,
there's like another layer in which you don't really know, or I mean, like maybe it's possible that like a mid-century audience would know exactly what that means. But me, as like an American viewer in 2020, I have like a much like less concrete sense of like what that would mean for that character. And so, yeah, I do think that, like, we can't, like, blame everything on the movie. Like, I think a lot of it is just, like, the distance of time and culture and whatever else. But, yeah, I wanted to know what, like, the protagonist was thinking and feeling. And I feel like that's, like, a pretty basic thing to desire from a movie.
Yeah, I really do think the movie fails. Sorry, George. I do think the movie sort of fails in that regard. George, were you gonna say something? Sorry.
Oh no, I just think that's a fair criticism.
Can I just add one more thing about that wedding scene? I just want to note two things, because I am so obsessed with this wedding scene. One is that when I was talking before about like the corporate pageantry, the fact that they have this gigantic wedding cake, like the biggest wedding cake I've ever seen in my entire life, that like is modeled after the dad's company's building, and then has like the rows where like the guy Furuya like committed suicide. First of all, baller move. Second of all, did we ever get a sense of like who made that cake or commissioned it?
Nishi says that he got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's like where that's the trap. So later on, I think that when he's about to throw the guy out the window, right? He says to Wada, or he says earlier to Wada, like, I brought that cake in to see people's reactions, and I noticed your reaction, and that's why now I'm pretending that you're a ghost.
Oh, I see. So he basically
It's like the mousetrap.
did like
It's the mousetrap in Hamlet.
like a designer cake in commemoration of his father's suicide. Like I said, crazy movie.
Which is just, I think, which we've all, like, experienced before, right? Like, we all know about that move. Like, it's like, oh yeah, here's a $20,000 cake commemorating my dad's death.
I do it at every wedding I go to, just as sort of like a side. Just like, I want to get revenge on everybody, whether or not they were involved with my father's murder, suicide, whatever you want to call it.
True story. My dad died on Halloween, so I'm just like, every time that the pageantry of Halloween is around, I'm like, oh yeah, this is just like part of this is like how I celebrate my dad's death.
Oh, George.
Trauma. But yeah, that's where the cake came from. But I put in the notes too, I was like, this is like one of the best opening wedding sequences. You can put it up there with The Godfather, and you can put it up with Deer Hunter. I was like, I love the wedding sequence. And also like that like Greek chorus of the guys in the suits kind of telling you what's happening. I thought it was just amazing.
The other thing, that I really loved about that wedding scene is that you first get this like swarm of like tabloid journalists come in, and they're pestering the hotel staff or whatever it is, like with all of these questions. And it's so intrusive to come out to a wedding and be like, who's gonna get arrested today? And then it turns out that like Kurosawa actually wants you to side with the journalists in asking these questions, because as beautiful as this wedding is, and oh my god, her kimono, her like bridal kimono is so beautiful. Kurosawa like basically comes in and it's like, okay, like you think that like the journalists are the bad guys or whatever, but actually like the point of this movie is for you to learn the truth. And so he really makes you like identify them very immediately with sort of like the more like chattery like populism of the journalists, and just like flips that switch on you, and I really loved that.
I would watch a 2.5 hour documentary about the filming of the wedding scene. For sure. Sign me the fuck up. I'd watch it tonight.
Well, in some ways it's like, I wonder, makes me think about this whole movie. So I watched it in two pieces because I started it too late one night and then finished it the next day. I wonder if it's one of these things. It's so dense in some ways. Like you have you have the journalists, you have the police, kind of. You then move into the family. Then you get sort of like the family dynamics. You get the sense that Iwabuchi is a shitty businessman in person, but like a good father. It's almost like I wish this thing were divided up into like 5 1-hour. I kind of wish this were prestige TV. Like I kind of wish we got prestige TV from
like
this
HBO
thing,
Succession.
Yeah, something like that, because it has that little bit of there's almost like it explores a whole bunch of things, but it doesn't go into depth on them in some ways. And I wonder if it's just it's again that weird fusion of like, we're gonna do Hamlet but make it film noir, which is totally like possible. Michael Armedia's film with Ethan Hawke, which was this clearly inspired or influenced, sort of did that a little bit too. I want to chat because one of the things that's come up a little bit in the course of doing this podcast is repeated quotes from Kurosawa making movies saying things like, I don't know anything about women. Like when prepping them, like they'd ask him questions, he'd be like, just do your thing. And obviously his filmography leans very heavily male. And so I'm sort of curious what you guys think of Yoshiko, the only female character, and sort of like the arc of her and the characterization. Because to me, I love the actress. She's, to me, like so easy to watch, and her scenes are really, really strong in that sense. But I feel like it feels like not only does the film not give her a ton of agency, but I sometimes feel like Kurosawa doesn't know what to do with female characters, like a little bit. What do you guys think?
I feel like she's pretty obviously a prop. She's like a vulnerable thing. And so basically the test of everyone around her is to see how they treat someone who is that vulnerable. Like the brother is protective. Nishi falls in love with her, right? Because in addition to being vulnerable, like she doesn't seem to have like a mean bone in her body. And so she's sort of like this like unrealistically pure thing in this like very corrupt house. And then at the end, she is going to be poisoned by her dad because her dad is a bad person. I think that like maybe you can give her some sort of credit for, you can give the script and the actress some credit for her trying to come to terms with the fact that her father can be a really evil businessman and like a really good dad, but also like you're 20 maybe years old, like is that cognitive dissonance really that dissonant?
Right. Yeah.
Like he's nice to you, but like he's mean to other people, but you're his daughter. Like that's not that hard to understand.
She's kind of a cipher, like Mifune's character Nishi is as well, right? Like that there's like a certain sense that you kind of get a feel for who they are as characters, but they're not really well drawn. At least that's how I felt about both of them too.
I think if you wanted to go a little bit further, like to go out like a little bit further out on a limb, you could even also kind of say that like it's sort of this like condescending portrayal of people with disabilities, because she's so like the brother is like a good person, but like at least the brother is aggro in some way, like he has sort of like a degree of edge to him, but like she has nothing.
Yeah, it's like it almost like saintizes her.
Yeah.
Like she can do no wrong. She he falls in love with her, and like there's like a hint of like, oh, poor her, like I have to be in love with her. Like it just doesn't realize her as a full character. It doesn't give her anything to push against, I feel like, in the context of the movie, and the shift to realizing her dad is evil is not as complex as I think it should be.
Yeah, and even that shift is like basically ultimately there for Nishi's sake. Right. For Nishi to have like someone to mourn him like when he's gone.
Yeah, and those final minutes of the movie, I was reading a little bit about Kurosawa's relationship to the movie, and it seems like across the board people really dislike the final, let's say 10 or 15 minutes of this movie when Yoshiko and forget his name, Tatsuyo show up, and we have the scene with the sort of Horatio character, and it turns out that Nishi's dead, and then we cut to this scene where we see Iwabushi on the phone talking to what is supposed to be like a Japanese government representative. That's never made clear, but that's what Kurosawa was envisioning. And it's interesting, one of the things he says is like the movie didn't go far enough because in Japan you couldn't go further. If I'd made this movie in America, the ending would be more critical, but as it stands, like this is as far as I could go in making a movie in Japan in the year that I made it. Does the ending work for you guys? What do you think?
Well, I felt so the melodrama of it did not, right? Like the confrontation with the kids and the father, that part didn't work. The part where they come and they talk to the Horatio character, you said, right? His friend who's like, oh yeah, they're dead. They're all dead. That part, like, I didn't mind the fact that their deaths happen off screen and that happened in this really cold-blooded way. I mean, I kind of actually like that part of it, in the sense like you don't see them die, that everything's orchestrated beyond, just like off screen, beyond what we see. That part I really liked, and I thought the imagery of like the busted car next to the railroad tracks was like really powerful. But yeah, the melodrama of the confrontation with the friend and then of the confrontation with the father, that was the part that I was like, oh, this is not working for me. Like if it didn't have those really over the top melodramatic moments, I think it would have been a much more impressive ending.
I think also it was like so hard to get a sense of why the friend was freaking out so much. I mean, like, yes, he lost his coworker, and yes, he lost his name, which, like, again, it's like a little bit weird. I'm just sort of like, why can't you just tell the world that it was like an undercover job and then get your name back and then get...
Well, because then he has to go to the DMV and get all that paperwork all over again. He's like, oh my God. He's like, have you ever been to the DMV? Have you tried to explain to them that your dead friend had your name for a while? It is impossible. It is
just
impossible.
Show them the movie. Be like, I brought the DVD of the it explains everything.
What you have to do is you have to roll in with a $20,000 cake that explains everything. All right, so here's this cake that represents everything that has happened in my life over the last month. This is my friend. He's dead now.
Are you understanding?
But trust me, this cake tells the entire story
Here's his
of my
clothes.
life.
We don't know like why the clothes are so pure and pristine, even though he was in like the bloodiest car accident of all time. Who stripped him and then like laid out his clothes? We have no idea. Don't ask questions.
They cut into the cake and they're like, "Oh, red velvet? Take a number."
What I think is really happening here is we're brainstorming a 6-episode true crime way to really break down the bad sleep well. I think it'll go over.
Well, can we do like
really.
a British Bake Off series by which we bake cakes that represent our favorite films? Like that's the reality
we're
show
getting somewhere.
we need to pitch to Netflix.
I think what you should do is go to your dad's place of work, and then that's like the building is like actually what you're supposed to do. It just has to be like the most boring like government building of like all time.
Just like really average architecture, nothing pretty about it. Just like kind of looks, but that's the right shape for a cake. So I feel like it wouldn't be that hard to do. I can't believe we've been talking about this for 2 minutes. Pretty amazing.
I mean, we could go for another half hour, but I will say also one more thing that I did also really like how cold and blasé the dad was at the end. Like when he gives the press conference and he's on the phone, he's like, "Oh yeah, they're dead." He's like, "It's done." Like it really, I think, illustrates how cold-blooded the character is, and I think that for me also like worked really well, even though the entirety of the ending didn't work.
But like if that guy is that cold, I just feel like I needed to feel like the frisson of like why it matters that his kids have rejected him. Like where is like that tender side of him that he presumably had in order to get his kids to love him so much.
Yeah, it doesn't really materialize. I think we're meant to sort of see the gesture of the barbecue. Everything you read about this movie is like, but don't forget about the barbecue scene. You're like, the barbecue scene is 45 seconds of this movie. It's not like I feel closer to this guy as a character.
Is it the scene where he's wearing the apron and he walks into the
Yeah, that whole bit.
The barbecue.
And then he gets the phone call and has to leave. Inkoo, you wrote this really great essay about Parasite.
Okay.
Well, and I just wanted, I was reading it earlier, and I was wondering sort of what there's a moment in this movie that made me think about Parasite a little bit, in that there's one of the things that sort of like makes the story a little more nuanced is the moment where Nishi claims that says that his father left him a few $1 million and he's used this money to like fund his revenge plot. And I think in maybe a better movie there might be some, not even a better movie, but the movie doesn't really go anywhere with that. It doesn't question it. And it made me think a little bit about Parasite in the sense that the Parasite is a movie, so it asks us to sympathize, but also it challenges our relationship to everybody in the movie. And then I sort of started to think a little bit about how there's a weird, bizarre parallel where in both films people pretend to be people they're not in order to achieve some kind of goal. So in the case of Parasite, it's that they get all these jobs with the family, but in the case of this film, it's Nishi kind of joining this corporate ladder in order to get revenge on the people that murdered his father. And I was wondering, did you guys see any resonance or parallels with Parasite, or am I way out in left field here? I'm curious.
I think the only thing that comparison really does for me personally is to underscore how clear like the quote unquote like revenge plot in Parasite is compared to like the one here. Like what did he spend that $1.5 million on? And also isn't he like a prosecutor or like a cop? Wouldn't the government pay those expenses for him? Like what is happening?
So Nishi, we got to talk about your cake budget. It is
I was going to say, it's all the cake. It's all the cake.
Astronomical. Where's all this? You really need this much money for a cake? Is like, it's essential to the plan. And by the way, delicious. The other comparison, obviously, is the ways in which I think kind of just capitalism dehumanizes all of us, right? And that like, regardless of like where you are in the system, and this is what was great about, I think, like Inkoo's reading of Parasite as well, that any sort of aspirational politics within the capitalist system, or any just kind of aspirational politics, right? It's impossible to divorce it from capitalism, is in and of itself poisonous. So what I think where the comparison necessarily doesn't work is that the revenge in The Bad Sleep Well is pure revenge. Like, he's not like, I'm going to kill the CEO because A, I want to be CEO, and B, I need the bathroom key for the 7th floor because that's where the really great bathrooms are. So you don't get like, it's not about him like being aspirational other than the sense of like, I need to get revenge for my dead dad. But there is this overwhelming sense of like, yeah, any sort of kind of capitalist structure will turn you eventually into a monster.
Yeah, I think there is sort of like a muddling of like the critique there, because like the movie seems like it's about a larger critique of corporate malfeasance, and sort of like that arrogance that comes with it, and yet the protagonist is so myopically focused on his like daddy drama, basically.
Yeah.
That like yeah, I mean, like, you get the critique, but like it never sort of develops to that next level that you want the critique to be, if that makes sense.
Right. It totally makes sense. And I also think you use the phrase daddy drama, and I wonder if that would be a good alternate title for The Bad Sleep.
God damn it. I was thinking the same exact thing, Liam.
Yes! Yes!
The dad.
We might be 3,000 miles away, but we are
film,
insane.
The Bad Sleep Well, or in the original Japanese, Daddy Drama, is available on the Criterion.
The Dad Sleep Well.
The Dad Sleep Well.
Because they're dead.
The bad dad sleep well. But yeah, there's all these things that the movie doesn't explore, like his dad being part of like the grift a little bit, and taking money illegally, and it there's all that stuff there that could complicate the narrative in ways that are interesting that the movie never materializes.
Not that we're supposed to really be like editing the movie, but I think the like most sort of nuanced piece of that criticism of corporate malfeasance was actually when I think it's Nishi who says something like, oh, like, don't mind that like middleman guy because he's only a functionary, like he is not able to make like the big decisions, so we have to like blame the big guy. And I think maybe it's possible that like if the person he was like gunning after was like a middle manager, I think it would be like a lot more interesting than if you just had this like totally bad guy with these like golden hearted children. I don't think golden hearts are a thing, but you know what I mean.
We know what you
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. Yeah.
I think to that point, like, there's an interesting I was thought about this movie as a little bit of like a poisonous version of Ikiru, where it deals with like, you know, the way bureaucracy and being part of that culture, like in that case, eventually inspires this guy to do something meaningful with the last years of his life, or in the case of that, whereas the opposite is true in The Bad Sleep Well. But there's almost I thought a little bit about like how there's almost in some ways this feels like a precursor to a video game where like he keeps moving up the ladder like to the big boss, and it doesn't, I mean, it doesn't quite like mean anything because none of the sort of those roles are not clearly as defined. We don't really necessarily understand entirely who these people are, and that could be an issue of this film being made in 1960 and us not, you know, not speaking the language, but it doesn't feel like we have a clear sense of the delineations between a lot of these people as well. So, well, that's The Bad Sleep Well. I still think it's worth seeing. It's beautiful to look at.
I think so too, yeah.
But it's definitely not your entry-level Kurosawa movie. Do you have a favorite Kurosawa movie, Inkoo?
Yojimbo. I love Yojimbo. And I found out that you guys are discussing Yojimbo next week. So that's great for me. But I love Mifune's performance in that. And also, I feel like he never really gets the credit for being as funny as he can be. And it's such a wonderfully comic, physical performance that he does in addition to everything else. And that's sort of like weird little like butt wiggle as he like walks away into the mists or whatever is like my lasting image of that movie.
It's such a
really,
good movie.
really good.
I
And it's
can't wait
actually
to see it
only
again.
one of the ones I only saw for the first time in the past few years, which is crazy. I feel like I neglected seeing that film for so long. Inkoo, let's talk about your Pedro Almovodar podcast, because we kind of have similar projects going here where we deep dive into a specific filmmaker's filmography. What made you decide to do Almovodar?
It's actually really simple. I have a friend, my co-host, who I had been watching a bunch of movies with during quarantine, and basically he told me he had never watched an Almodovar movie, and I like completely blew my stack. And we watched All About My Mother first, which was my first Almodovar movie, and then we watched Voltaire, and then I thought, oh, this would actually be a really good podcast. I think our tagline is an introduction to loving the films of Pedro Almodovar. He has turned into a full-fledged fan, but I think the podcast is nice because one of us has watched basically all of his movies, and Daniel was coming in really cold, and so wherever you are on that spectrum, hopefully you can relate.
For sure. Yeah, I actually have seen sort of the big ones, like All About My Mother and
Talk to her,
but there's a whole bunch and I've seen the Skin one, which is I saw opening night randomly and was like, whoa. So yikes, but I really liked it.
That's
so
one of the
I'm
recent
excited.
ones too, right?
Yeah, I think 2012.
Yeah, like 5. Yeah.
I think the other thing that like sort of bums me out a little bit is that he had that like magnificent run in the 2000s, and I think he's sort of fallen a little bit from his perch until Pain and Glory, and so it's been really great to just revisit them and try. And not that like Almodovar needs any sort of recuperation, but just to like get him like a little bit extra press, because he hasn't like been on the top of the director lists in a minute, and he really deserves to be like all the way up there. In my humble
Singular
opinion.
talent for sure. Yeah.
My wife was in a bar in Madrid once. She lives there, and she noticed there was an older gentleman in the back surrounded by like a bunch of very, very beautiful men. And she walked by to go to the bathroom. She was like, "Holy shit, it's Almovodar! That's incredible!" She was like very excited about it. Inkoo, we're really happy to have you on the show. And do you want to chat about some of the writing? I know you just wrote a piece for Hollywood Reporter about your top 10 TV shows of the year.
Yeah, I don't think that requires much explanation.
That's true.
But also go check out the list, because I think I put some really good TV shows on there.
We'll share links in the metadata and on Twitter.
Great. Thank you.
I am really excited to watch The Good Lord Bird. I haven't had a chance to dig into it yet, but like I read it. I had to read the description like 3 times, and I was like, wait, what is this?
The Good Lord Bird.
What's this?
It's on Showtime. It stars Ethan Hawke, who I have to say, like, I fucking love now, like way more than I did in the 90s. And he's playing John Brown, the abolitionist, and basically the show is a period comedy about slavery, making fun of one of the most famous abolitionists in U.S. history. It really shows him in all of his like white hot self-righteousness, and also his like excruciating delusions of grandeur. And like the dialogue is just so beautiful. It's a very like mannered dialogue in the way that like so much of period things are, but the dialogue is so exquisite and it's so funny. And
cool,
so and it's about slavery. So really, I don't know how better to like sell that. But like,
it's been kind of a crazy good year for TV, I have to say.
I mean, it's been like a crazy good 10 years for TV.
Yeah. Probably a clearer way to put it. Yeah, it's a great list. I'm a big fan of John Wilson's movies, and I've just started to watch How To with John Wilson, and I think it's really, really great. But we will include a link to this and your great Parasite essay and All About Almovodar folks can check out. And we're really glad that you joined us.
Thank you, Inkoo. It was awesome.
Thanks for having me and making me watch this movie that I'm glad I watched, even though it was such a pain to get through.
the cake is in the mail.
Yeah, we sent you a cake.
Yeah. Good. It's happy suicide cake to
what
me.
If we sent all of our guests cake, but there was something ominous about it, and they were like, "What's wrong with these guys?"
Well, it has to be in some sort of way thematically linked to the episode they appeared on. Yeah. So like,
exactly.
Who's appearing with us on Yojimbo, we'll send them like a cake shaped as like a sword.
It sounds like a good idea. Speaking of Yojimbo, we're going to talk about Yojimbo next, probably with Brian Cogman, who's writer on Game of Thrones and is doing some interesting things right now. We've got our Patreon, patreon.com/Uverbusters. We did a little episode about Mank, and I'm going to talk about Let Them All Talk, which is one of my favorite movies of the year, and I feel like not enough people are talking about that movie, so I decided to talk about it. And please rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Please, we need you.
Please,
we need you to do that.
please.
Why can't you guys write reviews?
I know. I'll write them for you. Just shoot me an email.
Give me your iTunes login so that I can log in.
Dear people in podcasting world, listen to this podcast that George is a handsome devil, and so on and so forth. They write themselves.
Be great.
Yeah.
It'll be great. I was Liam Billingham.
I was George Fagopoulos.
I'm still alive. My name is Inkoo Kang.
Yay! This was Uverbusters.
Bye, y'all.